Yeah. What was the one before it? I put James and I just forgot his last name. I forgot his middle initial.
Okay, we're talking about the quiz. People are still taking the quiz, gentlemen. Okay, so we continue through the 1960s. What word have you ever heard used to describe the 60s? Starts with a T. Anybody? There's a word people often use doing just the 60s. Starts with a T, has a B in the middle of it. It was known as a very, come on, vocab people. What? Who said that? What'd you say? Turbulent decade. Very good, Savannah. A very turbulent decade, the 1960s, as we have seen, right? Assassinations, protests, race riots. We're going to see protests. Wait, we did watch that yesterday, right? About Kent State this month. No?
No, sir.
We got up to that yesterday?
The sound didn't work. Yeah.
So, is that where we got up to though? So you got everything up to that point, the election of 68? Things that were going on. Oh, come on. Introduce you to this guy. We don't have time to say any more about him, except that you should know, hey, when you hear Henry Kissinger, you should think, hey, that was Nixon's right hand man when it comes to foreign policy, especially Nixon promised, he ran on a campaign of, he's going to get us out of Vietnam. Did he do it? Yeah. I mean, he didn't do it right away. That would have been a disaster. We're going to find out it was a disaster in the end anyway. But what other slogan or idea did he run on? He's going to be the president of blank and blank TV show. Law and order, because of everything that was going on, all the chaos in our culture. He and Congress changed the draft system from the regular draft to a lottery-based draft, tried to eliminate all deferments, tried to eliminate the idea that if you had to go, you didn't have to go. And what a difference in generations from the greatest generation where they ran to the recruiter's office without being drafted in defense of their country, World War II. Now, you could argue very effectively that that's because America was attacked. And in Vietnam, America itself was not attacked, right? But your country was calling you, and many people did the exact opposite. Ran not to, but from, burned draft cards, things like that. That leads us to what happened at Kent State. Again, less than an hour. I can get there in less than an hour. And this happened right near here in 1970. Another black mark on American history.
On May 4th, 1970, the Ohio National Guard
Don't start with me.
opened fire on students protesting the Vietnam War, leaving 4 students dead. This tragedy, known as the Kent State incident, further divided a nation already torn over U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and it had lasting effects on the political stage. Students protested against the Vietnam War in large numbers. Young people who watched their friends, siblings, and peers being drafted were particularly active in demonstrating. And by 1970, U.S. involvement in Vietnam had actually begun to decrease. That is, until April 28th, when President Richard Nixon authorized a preemptive strike for troops to cross from South Vietnam into Cambodia. 2 days later, he made a televised speech justifying these actions. This triggered a new wave of anti-war demonstrations. On May 1st, the day after Nixon's announcement, 2 peaceful rallies were held at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. Later,
Just making sure you're paying attention. Nixon had ran on the promise to get us out of Vietnam. We were drawing down troops, right? Went from 550,000. So by 1970, probably less than half of that, probably less than 200,000 by May of 1970. So there's an obvious us getting out of there. But in late April of 1970, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were using, again, their neighbor Cambodia. Remember we talked about the Ho Chi Minh Trail? They were using Cambodia as a launching pad into the south. So as Commander-in-Chief, Nixon went ahead and ordered bombing there. Well, you're bombing a country that we're supposedly not at war with. Well, yeah, because they're using that space to invade our troops from the south. You understand what's going on? Well, things had quieted down a little bit as far as the protests because, hey, everybody saw that we're eventually going to get out of there gradually. But then when this bombing takes place, now all the students get all riled up again. And so for these several days into early May of 1970, not only at Kent State, but campuses across the country, protests are happening. It just so happens that Kent State's where the crisis took place.
that's when 100 guardsmen confronted the protesters with M1 rifles. What happened is still clouded in confusion. The general commanding the guard ordered the crowd to disperse from a jeep, but was met with chants and rock throwing. The guard retaliated with tear gas and advanced using bayonets on their rifles to push the crowd back. And it worked. The crowd dispersed. But then, as witnesses say, 28 of the guardsmen who had retreated up a hill fired between 61 and 67 shots, some in the air and some directly at the protesters. 4 students were killed. Victims Jeffrey Glenn Miller and Allison B. Krause were protesting, and William Knox Schroeder and Sandra Lee Scheuer were just bystanders. All were between 19 and 20 years old, and they were students in good standing. 9 other students were also injured. Troops claimed they opened fire after being shot at by a sniper, but spectators heatedly denied that there were any gunshots before the guard opened fire. After the incident, Newsweek published an article with a famous photo of a 14-year-old runaway kneeling over one of the students who had been shot and killed. This photo would become a symbol of the climate of America during the Vietnam War and the violence and chaos brought on by the war itself. People became more injured and vocal about the Vietnam War than ever before. Militant activism broke out across college campuses all over the country. On May 9th, 100,000 protesters demonstrated in front of the White House. But less than a week after the demonstration, a shooting occurred on another university campus. At Jackson State University in Mississippi, city and state police opened fire on a group of students, killing 2 and injuring 12. These tragedies may have spurred anti-war activism, but the resulting protest also provoked a counter-movement from conservatives and a surge in patriotism. Some argue that this reaction from those who disagreed with the protesters, often called the silent majority, handed Nixon the presidency in 1972.
So you're an adult in 1970. You have lived through the late 1960s. You've seen all these protests, these race riots. Nixon's running on the idea that he's going to bring law and order and all this confusion to an end, right? And in May 1970, you see these young, college, hippie, you understand the difference in generation? You don't see the world the way they see it. They see it as, hey, I'm asserting myself and my independence, and I'm going to protest at the college and disrupt everything that's going on, disrupt business in the city of Kent, wherever these colleges work. And what she mentioned as the silent majority, you had most of the voting population out there looking at this like, now, no one would say what happened on May 4th was good, but you had them looking at the whole scene of what's going on in America saying, somebody's got to bring this country under control. Does that make sense? So there's a big generation gap developing here. And the silent majority is true. They weren't out protesting, sitting in their homes on TV, looking at the TV, maybe not on May 4th, because that was awful, but on all the other days with all the other protests saying, we got to stop this nonsense. Hey, it was similar just 2 years ago. If you were paying attention, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago in 2020, there were riots all over America because of the race situation. You remember that? You remember the burning police stations? Billions of dollars in damage. Not that many people killed, thankfully. But what were most Americans saying? Somebody's got to get this under control. All this chaos, right? So the other thing to add to this is in 2020, there were people saying, hey, we should bring the National Guard in. Trump should order the National Guard. Well, this memory is still emblazoned in people's brains. What happens if you bring the National Guard? What happens if in Kansas City, I mean, that was before 2020, where these riots and things were taken? What was that? Portland. What's the main one where written out?
Oh, Kenosha.
Wisconsin, right, thank you. So if the National Guard was brought in, what could have been the result? Do we ever want this to happen again? Do you understand what happened here? Our troops killed our people. So, we got to get it under control. Trump should bring in the National Guard. And have this happen again? Right? What was going on was awful. The other people were saying, let them, they'll burn out. Unintended. All of this, they'll lose energy. Okay, we got to put up with the billions of dollars of damage. We got to put up with all their anger and hostility. But if we send in the National Guard and then they do we ever want a situation where American troops are killing Americans? Right? And that's what happened here. No matter if you agreed with the protesters or didn't agree, if you were one of them who were saying, hey, these people got to be stopped. And there were people in America 2 years ago saying, yeah, send the National Guard in. And if they keep doing it and looting and burning, then, hey, they deserve it. But most Americans agree. This is tragic for American troops to turn their guns on Americans. She was done? Oh gosh, look who comes up. Oh, I'm sorry, you had to endure that picture there for a second. Okay, moving on. Questions, comments?
The National Guard troops opened fire on protesting students 50 years ago today.
Okay. Questions, comments? No comments? No questions? What was going on in America other than that? Hey, here's some good news. John F. Kennedy, at the beginning of the 1960s, said, we're going to the moon. The Ruskies might have beat us into space, Drew, but we're going to do the ultimate. We're going to go land on the moon, and an American astronaut is going to walk on another surface other than the Earth. Or did he? I'm just kidding. I look at Jake because he seems to be, I don't think he really believes it, but he likes to bring up the. Did you know there's people that think that the lunar landing didn't happen? Do you know that's true? The flat Earth people?
Yeah.
So they're going to show Neil Armstrong and the flag and they go, hey, there's no wind, atmosphere here. How's the flag not just hanging still there? That's proof. This was all Hollywood. So July 20th, 1969, America does, just a decade before, what was considered almost the unthinkable. Kennedy, are you crazy? We hadn't even at that time put a person in a space capsule and orbited the Earth, let alone going 240,000 miles away. And by the way, with technology 60 or 50 some years ago, you realize the precision that had to be to launch this module and have it land 240,000 miles away on a surface that, you know, if you're on the moon, it might seem big, but in the vast array of space, it's kind of like not even a dot. And we landed it right on there. Amazing. By the way, you probably heard of Neil Armstrong. You probably maybe even heard of Buzz Aldrin, but maybe you never heard of Michael Collins. I don't know, but these were the three astronauts aboard. Of course, Armstrong gets all the headlines because he was the one that first set foot and said those famous words. Those famous words. Oh, yeah. Now, this is more like it. We can handle Johnny Cash. What's the famous words Neil Armstrong uttered? Yeah. The eagle has landed, and then one small step for man. I've had my share, too, of these commercials. By the way, USPS.
Perhaps 50 years from now or more, when people think of the past, they will look at the pictures from last night. But without waiting that long, here is a shortened and edited version of last night's romantic and technical history.
That'd be a little scary.
30 seconds over just Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Rocket 20, Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Okay, got the flag up now. You can see the stars and stripes. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you did. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. And for people all over the world, I am sure they too join with America in recognizing what an immense feat this is.
And that, of course, was the voice of President Nixon. He talked to the astronauts. Questions, comments on that? Nobody has questions or comments on the lunar landing? I asked this question before, who would be, if you had the money, that you would go ahead and pay for the, was it SpaceX that Elon owns? Musk? That you would pay for a trip to Mars or something? You would do it? Anybody else? You would? What if it was half your money? Whatever amount of money you had. Let's say you were a billionaire, but you had to pay half of it to go to.
You'd still be well off. If you have like 50 grand in the bank and it's half of that, then no. Depends on how much money you still have left.
I don't know.
I would do that. That's like peak of life to be on Earth.
Terraforma.
I want to go to space. No, like you might die so like going to the moon. Not like the actual.
Just positive.
I had $1 billion.
Okay,
Would you?
what if you had to wear a mask on your,
Well, I would hope you would. You're in an astronaut suit. That's a good point.
You know, they make you wear a mask.
yeah, you'd have to wear.
They'd
Wear
have
a mask
6 foot
under
distance.
Last thing. Any other comments, questions? If you'd like to explore more about those people that don't believe that the lunar landing actually happened, you can go to a website called flatearthsociety.com and you can join in their lunacy and probably get a membership card, bumper sticker. You're a member of, you and Kyrie. Soon Kyrie will have a lot of free time on his hands, I hear.
That's
The peak of your existence.
Probably right.
That's her winning.
All right, what else is going on? Have you ever heard of the EPA? Have you ever heard of OSHA? Have you ever heard of the USPS? Yes, you have. You've heard of all these things, I think. Maybe not OSHA, unless you have a parent that works in a occupation that has to go by all of these guidelines and mandates that are put forth by government. Well, these are new entities when it comes to America. You might not even know that most of America's history, there was no federal income tax, let alone having all of these agencies lording over us, regulating our lives. The EPA, put in place under the Nixon administration in 1970, an organization of the federal government that gets a pretty good amount of power to decide things like, hey, America is sitting on decades, if not centuries, of natural gas and oil to be able to not only fuel through your grandchildren, but also export a lot of our fuel to the rest of the world, to the tune that we're like, we'd be paying maybe $2 a gallon of gas. Instead, the EPA has certain rules that you can't drill here and you can't drill there because you might disturb some wildlife or some cricket or whatever species that you can come up with to keep America from drilling the oil. Or you have OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that is the go-to department for, anybody that owns a business. You have to have certain things in place for the safety of all the people that work and or visit there. And all of these regulations, Americans have agreed in the last 60 years, basically, since the 60s, that these are regulations that we think are good. They are all meant to keep us safe. They might cost a lot of money to implement, but we're willing to pay that cost because we believe that the federal government has our best interest in mind and is going to make rules that are best to keep everybody safe. So this is what we have. And there's always been a post office, right? Well, going back to the late 1800s, but the actual United States Postal Service that we have today wasn't until 1971 put into place. So those are other things going on in Nixon's administration in the early 70s. Questions, comments about those? That's not UPS, that's USPS, United States Postal Service. Did I say system?
No, but you got post office on there, but postal.
Well, right. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I think they're off. Questions, comments? No? You don't have comments because you just want to be done, or you legitimately have no curiosities, questions, thoughts? You know, part of the learning process would be better if there was interaction. Ask questions, and if I don't know the answer, I'll say,
We'll see the moon and it looks fake. Looks at it.
I mean, that's something Hollywood can do, right?